Hi everyone, I am Dr. Monique Smith Gadson with Transforming Visions Counseling and Consulting Services. Thank you so much for visiting my YouTube today. I am hoping that you will subscribe to this channel. I hope that you will share this channel with others who might find the content here valuable and insightful and helpful to them. I It can also be found on Instagram, on Facebook, and Twitter at Transforming Visions. And my website is drmoniquesmithgadson.com. That's GADSON.com. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about spiritual abuse. I spoke about spiritual abuse some time ago and said in that particular video that I would come back and talk a little bit more about spiritual abuse, especially from the church's perspective. Having been on a church staff for over 16 years, I find this topic to be very interesting and also very much needed, and we don't discuss this often enough as we need to. So I'm just going to come and talk about spiritual abuse a little bit, and just for review's sake, I'm going to define spiritual abuse again. I did in the first video, but I'm going to take a moment and read this definition by Lisa Ruth Oakley that she came up with in this article that she's written about spiritual abuse. So I'm going to read the definition that she uses as spiritual abuse, okay? So spiritual abuse is coercion and control of one individual by another in a spiritual context. The target experiences spiritual abuse as a deeply emotional, personal attack. This abuse may include manipulation, exploitation, enforced accountability, censorship on decision making, requirements for secrecy and silence, pressure to conform, misuse of scripture or the pulpit to control behavior, requirement of obedience to the abuser, the suggestion that the abuser has a divine position, isolation from others, especially those external to the abusive context. Okay, so that is the definition of spiritual abuse. It's quite wordy, but having to capture the experiences of those who have experienced spiritual abuse, it had to be very detailed and very specific so we know exactly what it is that we're dealing with. I'll say this now and talk about it a little bit more in detail a little bit later, but it's important that we really understand what spiritual abuse really is, how we define it, because part of the problem in reporting it and knowing how to write policy for it, and even for people to recognize if I am a spiritual abuser or if I have been spiritually abused, is very important surrounding this definition. So we really have to make sure that we understand specifically what spiritual abuse involves, how we define it, so that it can inform our decisions as we talk about policies, as we talking about informing people of what spiritual abuse is, and also being able to understand how we need to be careful and safeguard against it as well. Okay, so that is what spiritual abuse is. And if your church does not have written policy and procedures surrounding spiritual abuse, which a lot of churches that I've kind of interfaced with do not have that, it is going to be something that you really want to go ahead and consider defining what spiritual abuse is, and starting to have that conversation among your leadership as to what do we do with the disclosure of spiritual abuse. So we really have to start really thinking about what is a person's experience with spiritual abuse, so that we can determine what is this process like. How do we make ourselves available when there's a disclosure? Who do you tell? Do you think a person who is being abused within a spiritual organization is feeling safe enough to tell someone in that organization, would they not wonder if everybody is going to side on the organization's perspective versus what they are saying? So it's a lot that has to be taken into consideration when we are talking about developing a policy and a procedure around it. But I strongly suggest that as a leadership development training, we start talking about this. We really, really need to wrap our heads around what spiritual abuse is. And we also need to make sure that we understand that spiritual abuse is not just necessarily one of the people on the spiritual leadership team who is abusing a congregant, because there are people who can be a part of the leadership teams themselves who can be a victim of spiritual abuse by someone else that might be in a position of authority. I actually sat and listened to a gentleman who was on staff at a church talk about his experience with spiritual abuse, and it was heart-wrenching. It was hard to hear. He still suffered from that experience, although he had been through years of counseling and he had gotten out of that particular situation. But there's another way to look at spiritual abuse. So it's not just leadership to a church member, but it could also be among the leadership team. It could be a person that is on the leadership team being abused by someone else that might be in a position of authority. So we want to take that into consideration as well. So how do we create a policy? Where does this person go? This gentleman talked in detail about how hard it was for him, because who could he tell? If he told a coworker, he was told basically like, that's just the way things are here. If you can't deal with it, you're free to leave, go somewhere else. But this was his family's livelihood. This was his call to ministry, and he felt that this is what he was supposed to be doing, and just did not really understand that it was truly abuse until there was much damage that had been done to him and his family as a result of that. So when we're starting to tease through this, we really, really need to, again, go back to making sure we understand what spiritual abuse is. How is it that we can implement policy? We need to write this in new members or our membership handbooks. And we need to define what spiritual abuse is. And then we need to talk about what do we do when we are reporting experiences of spiritual abuse. To whom do we report it? Do we go to a governing body that is outside of the church? If we were to look into a denominational governing body, there may be some hesitancy to even report it there if, say, for example, there are members of or leaders of this particular church that might serve on or as an officer in the overall governing body. Then they're going to feel that this is a partner with the church, or is this organization, this governing body, truly a partner in safeguarding? So there are lots of questions and lots of relationships and dual relationships that have to be considered. How do we even create an independent governing body? Who do we consider a safeguarding officer? Yeah, it's a lot that churches really need to come around their table to talk about, because the one thing that we need to do is to send the tone, set the environment, stating that this is a church that does not tolerate abuse. Now, no one can micromanage anybody's behavior. Unfortunately, we do get people that come in kind of unaware, that wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will, and we have to deal with those situations as they come up, case by case. However, as a church body, the culture needs to be such that it is known, it is stated, it is defined. We understand what spiritual abuse is. We understand that it is a serious offense. We understand that people who have been damaged as a result of spiritual abuse deserve our ear. They deserve our honoring their pain, and they deserve our ability to be able to not only safeguard them, but to safeguard others who may also present with this issue in the future. Preferably not, but we just need to have a policy in place. So again, the leadership team needs to come together. The officers, the board of directors, come together, host a training, hire a consulting therapist such as myself to come in and talk about spiritual abuse, talk about what people experience. Again, not only just the members of a particular faith organization, but also for the leadership team that is a part of that the leadership of that particular church. Okay. Another thing that I found quite interesting as I've been researching for this is that Christian counseling. A lot of people who had experienced spiritual abuse then became very leery of Christian counselors. And what they had found is that Christian counselors did not have an understanding of spiritual abuse and therefore tended to minimize it, which was quite distressing to me, who explicitly states that I am a Christian counselor, that we as Christian counselors do not have an understanding of spiritual abuse enough that we ourselves might minimize this or just handle it so poorly that this further triggers and damages the individual who's already been a victim of spiritual abuse. So this was quite distressing to me. And I guess maybe because I have equipped myself with understanding spiritual abuse since I was in a church setting, I just felt like I needed to understand it. I felt like I needed to be able to recognize it. I felt as though I needed to know what to do in case an individual came to me. Now, I can understand if someone was hesitant to come to me as part of that church's staff. I can understand why someone would say, well, you're part of the overall organization. Wouldn't you have like a stake in protecting the organization versus hearing my my situation, which that could be understandable. So I truly understand that, and I do believe that this requires us to have some independent referrals, people who are not affiliated with the church whatsoever, that we can collect, some maybe Christian based, maybe some who are not or may not explicitly state that they're Christian counselors. We may be able to provide people with information, but the caveat there is that there are some people who will take the information and be grateful that there is someone that they can contact outside of the context of this church. However, again, it may look as though if you are partnering with this church as a referral, then you potentially could be partnering with this church as it relates to my spiritual abuse. And will I really have this setting, this environment where I'm safe and I'm free to share and disclose the extent of the nature of what I have experienced without there being some further backlash to the victim of spiritual abuse? So just to kind of quickly recap again, making certain that we truly understand what spiritual abuse is. We need to be able to define it. We need to be able to put it in places where our church members see it. They recognize that the church is taking seriously this idea that spiritual abuse can take place, that we want to make sure that you understand what it is. We're telling you we are understanding what it is, and this is going to be our policy, our procedure as to how you can disclose it, to whom those disclosures are made, who reads those, if it's an independent body outside of your church. Here are a list of referrals. We need to send the message to people, members, or again, those on the ministerial or the spiritual leadership staff as well. We need to send the message that there is a procedure in place where you can safely disclose. Some action will follow your disclosure, and you need to know specifically what that is and how it very well may involve you or not, for that matter. So understanding what spiritual abuse is, creating policies and procedures around that, understanding that spiritual abuse can also happen to those on a spiritual leadership team, not only just the members of a particular faith. Here today, again, I've been talking about the Christian faith, but it happens in any faith tradition. Prayerfully, I have given some insights that you can extract from this discussion and that you can apply to other faith traditions as well. I work in a Christian church. I am of the Christian faith. That's been my experience. Therefore, I speak specifically of the Christian faith. And Christian counselors, making certain that we are equipped, that we understand what spiritual abuse is, so we don't find ourselves doing any additional harm that these victims have already experienced. We need to make sure we understand what spiritual abuse is. We need to make sure we are part of a safeguarding procedure, and make certain that it doesn't appear that we are partnering with the church as it relates to not being able to create a safe space for victims to be able to disclose their experiences. So I do hope something that I've said here today has been informative. I do hope it gets you to thinking. I hope churches and their spiritual leadership teams will begin this process of developing policies and procedures, if you don't already have those in place, to please go ahead and develop those. Again, I am also a consulting therapist. This is what I do in my consulting work at Transforming Visions. I would be more than happy to come and conduct trainings for you, or to discuss further with you and your faith organization about ways that we can make certain that you are creating a culture where you're basically saying we are trying to eradicate any opportunity for spiritual abuse to take place. However, if it shall take place, this is going to be the policy and the procedure that we will follow. So thank you again for listening and coming by my YouTube channel. Hopefully you found this information to be informative and helpful for you. Please share it with others, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'm Dr. Monique Smith Gadson, Transforming Visions, Counseling and Consulting Services. Looking forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you so very much.